This is This Week in Science and Education, Episode 29, recorded Tuesday, March the 8th, Invasive Species in Waterways. It's time for This Week in Science and Education, the show that talks about the latest advances in health research, scientific discovery, and helps teachers integrate that into their curriculum-based classroom activities. On today's show, Dr. Andrea Kirkwood from the University of Ontario Institute of Technology talks about invasive species. Are they taking over our waterways? If so, what can we do about it? Catch the show next to find out. All that and more coming up next on This Week in Science and Education. This Week in Science and Education is brought to you by Sheridan Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. At Sheridan, students shine brighter. Visit SheridanShineBrighter.com and find out how Sheridan students are leading the way in the digital media space. Hey everybody, it's time for This Week in Science and Education. This is your host, Kevin Cougler, and Virtual Researcher on Call. Glad you took the time to catch today's episode. Interesting episode today, Invasive Species in Waterways. We'll be talking with Andrea Kirkwood from the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. But before we get to Andrea, let me introduce my regular co-panelists. And I see we have a familiar face back from the windy city of Chicago. Hey Thomas, how was your trip?
Trip was awesome, really good. Lots of good science, lots of good travel. One of those, yeah, it's a good trip.
Good stuff. I noticed you didn't try and join us last week. You must have been having a really good time.
It was a lot of work, travel. I don't know how people who travel for a living managed to get through it, but you know, it was good. Still working on the grant application, the whole point of that trip, but it was worth the time.
Good political answer. I have a feeling you were having a good time, even though I'm sure you were working till 2 or 3 in the morning. But how can you not go to Chicago and check out some of the amazing architecture there? Fantastic city. Anyways, I won't put you on the spot anymore about that trip. Colin, Jagoe, Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board. Hey, Colin.
Hey, Kev. How's it going, bud?
Good, good. We're going to have an interesting show. We're going to talk about how fish, invasive species, taking over waterways today. That should be interesting. So joining us from the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, Dr. Andrea Kirkwood. Hi, Andrea. How are you today?
Hello. I'm doing great. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time to join us. I know we're really interested to hear about you and how you got to be at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. So maybe give us an idea on your career path and how you ended up at UOIT, and talk a little bit about your research.
Okay. Well, I probably should start out saying that when I was in high school and going off to university, the last thing I thought I'd ever be was a scientist. I had a variety of different career options I thought about, you know, getting into law or becoming a teacher, that sort of thing. But really it wasn't until I started my master's work that I found my love for research, and I really started to blossom. So I think it's important for students to realize that what they think is science and what a scientist does may not necessarily be the case. And so it's really important if they can meet a scientist in their community, whether there's a local university or a consulting company where there's environmental consultants, environmental scientists that work. It's really good to get an idea of what they actually do, because I really didn't know. But I did my master's up in cottage country in Ontario, and that really stems from my childhood, having a family cottage up in Halliburton, and always being really curious about nature and how nature works. And it really set the stage for me to be an aquatic ecologist. So when people ask me why I'm an aquatic ecologist, I say it has a lot to do with my childhood up in Halliburton on Canisius Lake. So
Nice.
There was a little bit of an indirect path to UOIT. I did my master's looking at phytoplankton in lakes and mercury accumulation. And then I did something a bit more applied, worked with the pulp and paper industry looking at cyanobacteria and pulp and paper waste treatment systems. So without getting too technical, microbes are really important in cleaning up the waste that we humans produce in our, whether it's sewage or industrial processes. And I was focusing on a specific microbial group. And then from there, I continued on focusing on microbial communities, but looking at really extreme ecosystems. So going from wastewater systems into what we call hypersaline systems. So really, really salty areas that plants can't live, animals can't live, but microbes can, because they've been around on the planet long enough to evolve these really interesting metabolic and physiological adaptations to living in extreme environments, such as hypersaline systems. And then that took me to another postdoc. This is what scientists have to do after they get their PhDs. They have to basically be an apprentice to hone their skills in science. And at the University of Calgary, just by fluke, based on the research I was doing, I happened upon Rock Snot, which we'll be talking about today. And when I first saw it, I actually thought there was a problem with an upstream sewage plant, that maybe some toilet paper and another refuse had been discharged, because it looks like wet toilet paper at the end stage of its growth cycle. And when I looked under the microscope, I was shocked to see that it was a diatom. And I'm an algal ecologist, and I knew right away what it was. And it just so happens at that time it was becoming a global invasive species, and so I really got on the front end of publishing work on it, and so you have it. So then all that kind of work and experience helped me get my job here at UOIT, and now I'm both a researcher and a teacher.
Andrea, before we get into the, and you did say Rock Snot, we did hear correctly, Rock Snot is the term that we're talking about today, so very interesting. I heard you mention the term aquatic ecology, and maybe just for the younger grades you could kind of explain what exactly does that mean to be in the field of aquatic ecology?
Well, aquatic simply means an ecosystem that is water-based. So it could be a wetland, it could be the ocean, it could be a lake, it could be a river. So it's quite a broad variety of aquatic ecosystems. And to be an ecologist is really to study the interactions of organisms and their environment, so specifically their aquatic environment, their water environment that they live in. Okay, super.
And so now you're working a little bit with Rock Snot, and kind of break that down a little bit for us and explain what this is all about.
Well, it's really unfortunate that we don't have some good visuals here, because and I'm sure the audience probably wasn't born at the time that shag carpet was really popular in households in the 70s. But if you were to envision Rock Snot, also known as, and you don't have to pronounce this all the time, Didymosphenia geminata. Short form is Didymo. But the media or the newspapers like to call it Rock Snot, because at one point in its life cycle, it does look very stringy and icky. So, but basically, when it's really growing well and taking over river bottoms, it looks like shag carpet for miles and miles down the stream. So, if you're into fishing, this is really something that is not very pleasing to fishermen, because it really affects the habitat. So the places where fish live completely covers and what we call displaces the food that fish eat. So all the little bugs that fish eat, well, they get clogged out because of this rock snot that takes over the entire riverbed.
Colin, I'm just wondering, do you have your computer connected? Can you, if Andrea was to give you a...
I'm trying. I'm seeing what I can do here.
Oh, yeah, so there's lots and lots of visuals online. We just do Rock Snot or Didymo.
We'll give Colin a few seconds or a few minutes to try and pull one of those up. If he does, great. And if not, Andrew, do you have a website that people could go to learn a little bit more about it?
I would really just get anyone who's interested in Rock Snot to do a Google search. I have a little bit of a blurb on my website, but my website's very minimal, and it really refers to my publications, which are a little bit, I think, too much information, if you will. So definitely there's lots of invasive species websites where Rock Snot is talked about. There you go. There's a nice visual. I think that comes from New Zealand, because it's very problematic in New Zealand right now.
Is it?
And New Zealand actually was blaming Canada, or at least North America, because they did genetic studies. So they look at the DNA that's in the rock snot, and they're able to match it with the same DNA from rock snot that's found in North America compared to other places where rock snot is found, such as Europe.
Wow.
So they believe that it was transported.
Okay. And how widespread is this? Is this a global problem, or is it localized in certain regions around the world?
Well, there's a lot of really interesting scientific questions about it, because Didymo, or rock snot, is native to North America and Europe and Asia. And in some places in Europe, even as far back as 100 years ago, there were reports of what we call in algal ecology as blooms. So a bloom, if you think of a flower blooming, we'll think of algae blooming, but just being lots and lots of it in the entire habitat that you find it in. So we don't really quite understand if this is a new genetic variant or mutant, or if this is actually in response to a changing global climate or environmental change. But it is invasive, particularly in New Zealand, where there's a lot of concern about it because they have a very important trout fishery in New Zealand, and it's becoming very problematic there. So it is now, and it's now been recently discovered in South America, so it's definitely considered a global invasive species now. And the main culprit are humans, and they believe that on the bottom of the, if you ever have seen a fisherman out in the river, the bottom of his feet, he has these felt soles, and so they're very squishy like sponges. And they're just perfect for absorbing Didymo cells that are microscopic. You need a microscope to see them, and transporting them from place to place where they fish. So the going hypothesis, so the idea or the explanation for the spread of Didymo is that Didymo was stuck to the bottom of these fishermen's felt-soled waders, and they brought them from one country to the other country, and that's how Didymo was transported.
Thanks for bringing up those pictures, Colin. Those were interesting to look at. I'm assuming you just Googled them, and that's how our listeners can find them.
I can honestly say for the first time today I Googled rock snot.
Yes.
That's interesting, Andrea. Maybe I'll let Thomas jump in here if he has a couple questions for you.
Yeah, Andrea, I thought maybe we could just sort of step back and talk a little bit about what do we mean by invasive species. And we have invasive species, we have introduced species, we have species that have been around that are now problematic. And you've got one really great example here, but talk about what it means to be an invasive species, if you would, and maybe why this is considered an invasive species. So if it's native to North America, is it also problematic here as well as New Zealand? And if it's problematic here, do we consider it an invasive species? And a little bit about how we talk about these kind of issues.
Well, you bring up really good questions, because I struggled with calling rock snot an invasive species. It really depends on where you are. In New Zealand, where it is not native, and the way it's behaving, absolutely, it has all the classic behaviors of an invasive species. So if we back up to really defining what an invasive species is it's any, it could be a plant, an animal, an alga such as rock snot that's being transported from its native habitat to a foreign habitat or a new habitat where it did not evolve and adapt and deal with all of the natural functions of that habitat. So when I'm teaching invasive species in my conservation biology class, we really look at, why are invasive species invasive? Well, they're invasive because they come to a new habitat. They don't have any diseases there that they've had to evolve with. They don't have any natural predators. And in many cases, why they're successful is they're very good at competing. They're very weedy. If they're plants, they tend to be very competitive for nutrients, or they have really good reproductive strategies. I don't want to get too technical here, but they just have a biology that allows them to come in and take over and become very dominant in the ecosystem. And so Didymo, with respect to North America, the way it's behaving is definitely, it has a lot of those characteristics where it completely takes over the community, but we know that it's native. And so I tend to refer to it more as a nuisance species, but it is a globally invasive species because now it's being found being problematic in South America and New Zealand, places it's never been found before.
So I think that gets to the point that you were just making. So if in North America we think of it as a nuisance species, do we have an idea why it's a nuisance now, or is this what you were saying with the earlier accounts of as much as a century ago with the idea that blooms were occurring then? We don't know whether this was problematic 100 years ago. Or do we know whether it was problematic?
Well, we're really dependent on the naturalists of the time, and there weren't many of them in North America. I think the oldest record of Didymosphenia geminata, which is the scientific name for rock snot, was back in the late 1800s in British Columbia. And there's other records of it around Lake Superior. It was always rare in the community. And so because we don't have samples from back then, it's very difficult for us to compare the current variety of Didymo, its genetics, to the former, or at least the native or the kind of baseline variety that we have nothing to compare it to. So the going hypotheses now are that it's either a new genetic variant that has this new adaptation to really take over under ideal conditions, or it's responding to environmental change. So it's actually the same, has the exact same genetics, but perhaps with global climate change and other environmental factors, it's just being able to do a lot better now. Because it is a cold water species, it tends to be in pristine systems. When I say pristine, think of clean, clear water. Wherever you see really good trout fishing, this is where this species does very well, which is very unusual for algae. Because when you think of algae, and you think of algae blooming, it usually causes blooms in lakes and rivers when there's lots of nutrients, lots of pollution, very degraded systems. But this organism is very unique in that it actually loves very clean ecosystems. So there's a lot of research yet to be done to really understand why it's changed its behavior and it's become so problematic.
Is there any indication that we might see sort of bloom and bust or feast and famine where you might have an area where the species comes in, cloaks over an environment, but then dies back off afterwards? I mean, is this a one-way street, or are we looking at possibly a cycle?
I think it's definite cycles, just based on what we've seen in Europe and we've seen out in Western Canada. I really feel it's an opportunistic microbe, so it really waits for the right conditions. So we could not see it for a couple of years, and then under drought conditions in the early 2000s in Alberta, it was very problematic. It seemed to really like the types of conditions when the water flow was much lower. I wrote a paper where I showed that where they build dams, so this is another role for humans, where we regulate rivers by stopping the natural flows and creating these big reservoirs and dams to hold water. Wherever the water comes out of a dam, Didymo does really, really well. So I was able to show that there's a very high incidence of these nuisance blooms where there are dams on these rivers. So there's a lot still we have yet to know, but we do know that the environment has to be very specific for it to do well. Otherwise, it just doesn't compete very well. And that's very typical of many weedy species. They're not very necessarily good competitors when everything's all kind of equal for other species to compete. There's very specific conditions where it kind of takes advantage, it's opportunistic, and it does very, very well.
We're talking today with Dr. Andrea Kirkwood from the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. I have an interesting invasive species story to share with you, but before I get to that, I'm going to let Colin jump in because he'll have actually something intelligent to say, whereas I just have a funny story. So, Colin, over to you.
Talk about, when you went to a new city or something like that. Just maybe give us an idea, if you would, Andrea, sort of, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, it's invasive, and we talked about the definition of invasive, but in a healthy ecosystem, what role does it play? Like, where does it fit in, a regular, say, Ontario-type stream? And then when it either becomes a nuisance bloom in an Ontario stream or it goes to, say, a New Zealand stream, like, what changes in the stream? So what role does it naturally play, and then what changes when you actually get this problem happening?
Okay, well, there's two things I want to address there. I'm so glad you brought up Ontario because I would like to actually study Didymo in Ontario, and specifically, it's not here. And I want to understand why it's not here, particularly since we have really good trout fishing streams in Ontario. So it's kind of going at asking the question, rather than just focusing on where Didymo is, finding a region where it's not, and that maybe will give us more answers into why it doesn't spread to certain areas. But anyway, that's as an aside. But normally based on, and again, we're really limited by the data we have. So there wasn't a lot of continuous monitoring of Didymo, in North America, for example. So we have kind of patchy bits of information. That information basically lets us know that it never was documented in bloom form or nuisance form until the mid-'80s on Vancouver Island when it first started appearing as a nuisance. So in that sense, it really, like many algae, were just rare and didn't really contribute greatly to the function of ecosystems, as a single species. But now what the concern is that when it's forming a bloom, and if you understand anything about energy and ecosystems, and for those students who've studied food webs, well, the base of the food web are primary producers. So when sunlight comes into an ecosystem, it's the plants. So in aquatic systems, it's the algae primarily that bring in sunlight energy, and that energy gets passed up through the food web. Well, when you have a large organism, so for anyone who wants to get back online and look at what Didymo looks like, it's a very large, relatively speaking, alga, and it's not very edible. So invertebrates, not many invertebrates and fish eat it. So if that's all that's available to eat, and not many animals can eat it, then that's going to have big consequences for how energy gets transferred up to the fish. And it's really the fish that people are interested in because they catch fish for recreational purposes and also for eating. So that's just one of the concerns about Didymo.
Speaking of fish, it's time for my story, and don't say I didn't warn you. So, Andrea, have you ever heard of this fish that walks on land and yet still swims in water?
I know I can't remember the name of it. It's a lungfish maybe in Africa, but I can't remember the species name.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it either, so, this could be completely unsourced. But a few years ago, we did a VROC Reaching Every Student session where a young researcher from the University of Toronto told this story of this fish that a couple brought over from China, and it was supposed to have medicinal purposes. And so they brought this fish over and put it in an aquarium in their house, and the fish, flourished in the aquarium, got too big for the aquarium, and then they let it loose in the waterways down in the north, I think it was the northeastern part of Pennsylvania or something like that. Anyways, this fish started taking over as an invasive species because, of course, they weren't native to the United States. And the fish actually reportedly, there's been some news reports on it, and I can actually source these out and put them in the show notes, but this fish actually walks from stream to stream, so they have a terrible time trying to catch this fish. And to this day, that is the most popular video conferencing session that we have ever done at VROC. It's been downloaded thousands and thousands of times by students all over the world, I imagine. And, they just love the idea of this fish that walks on water. And there's actually reports of it eating small, gophers and groundhogs and things of that nature as well.
Wow.
So apparently it's quite an invasive species. And I guess it's not really a funny story, but it is an interesting one. And I was just curious if you had heard of that particular fish.
Yeah, I think I do recall now in the U.S. there being a fish like that was introduced, but also what's been on the news quite a bit is the carp, silver carp in it's in the Mississippi River now. There's concerns about it getting into Canada, and if you go on YouTube, you can see how this fish is very jumpy, and so that if you start a boat motor, they jump out of the water, and they actually can be they're very heavy and large, and they can hurt people coming out of the water and knock them out of their boats. So that's,
I think I've seen that. They fly
it's
at
funny
people
to watch,
over
but it's
the
kind of
boat,
scary
right?
at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, we need to take a short break, and maybe when we come back, I think Colin's Googling that fish. He might actually pull it up for us. I don't know what he's doing. Yeah, he is. Okay. So anyways, I do want to mention our sponsors over at Mueller Systems. They are the developers of backup software out of Woodstock, Ontario, and a good sponsor of the VROC program. If you have some information out there and you don't want it to get lost, you might have a fish flying out of the water, coming in and gobbling up your computer, flying back in the water. You never know what could happen. You've got to get that data protected just in case. So Mueller Systems is the company to contact to help you with those needs. And that website is muellerdata.com/VROC. That's MULLERDATA.com/VROC. If you visit that website today, free for 90 days, you can try out their backup software and try it for yourself. See if it works, see if you like it, schedule it. And we do encourage you to give that website a shot. Again, it's muellerdata.com/VROC, and we do thank them for their support. Getting back to the show, we're talking with Dr. Andrea Kirkwood from the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. If I'm reading Colin's body language right, he wants to jump in. Go ahead, Colin. Oh, okay, what are we looking at here?
I think the one you're referring to is the Snakehead. And I was reading.
Oh, that's another one.
Yeah, and it's.
What's it called again, Colin?
Snakehead. It can walk on land and sort of go from body to body, and it's quite invasive and quite large and quite ugly. So yeah, there's some reports out of the States about it. So there's another picture of it right there for you.
Oh, that's awesome. That's not ugly. That's a beautiful fish. You know, it's all in the eye of the beholder.
I'll take your word for it, pal. Good
stuff. Hey, Colin, when do students learn about invasive species in the school system? At what grade level do they start studying this kind of thing?
There is some stuff in the elementary curriculum. If I get my camera back here, there is some stuff in the elementary curriculum where they talk about ecosystems and food webs and that sort of thing. In grade 9 and 10, they both do. There's some sections in the grade 9 and 10 curriculum where they look at like ecology and that sort of stuff, where you can look at food, like you mentioned food webs earlier, and energy through ecosystems, and all of that stuff is embedded right into particularly the grade 9 ecosystems unit in the science curriculum. So exactly what you were talking about in terms of the energy balance in an ecosystem. If you take away the base of the pyramid, so to speak, because of the Didymo using up more energy than what the normal algae, the normal phytoplankton, for example, would be using, then it's a pretty simple sort of understanding for even a grade 9 student that there's less energy through the system, and when you get up into the larger things like trout, there's not as much to go around. So yeah, it's all there. It's all there. And this is a really interesting case study to think about that stuff.
How could they, Colin, I'm thinking in terms of experiments, if they wanted to, run an experiment in the classroom to try, I guess since we don't have any rock snot in Ontario, it'd be hard to jump out, the local lake and grab some rock snot. But, and maybe, Andrew, you want to jump in there as well. But how do we teach children the effect of bringing in these species into a controlled ecosystem? How do we do that?
Well, I guess there's probably computer simulations you could use, but because this is happening out in nature, probably the best thing to do is to really look at case examples. There's so many invasive species out there, and each one has had devastating impacts to the ecosystems that they've invaded. And there's also economic impacts as well. So lots of, billions of dollars are believed to have been lost a year based on the agricultural impacts, the forestry industry impacts, as well as just recreational. So for instance, with rock snot, when it's causing a problem in a given river, people don't want to go there to go swimming, to recreate, and so that has negative impacts to the tourism industry, and that's why New Zealand is particularly concerned about it.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thomas, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so Andrea, sort of going back to what I had started to talk about a little bit earlier, one of the interesting things to me is why different species behave differently. So, you get one species that's introduced and it's present, and then you have another species that is introduced, or maybe in this case was there beforehand, but then you get this explosive expansion, right? So, a lot of my work is with Drosophila melanogaster, which is an African species that we've introduced to North America, and it's a little bit problematic that it flies around your house in the summer in the banana boat, but nobody's going to really think of this as an economic hardship. Is there something about? But if you look at something like the zebra mussel, which is an introduced species that has had a massive impact on its environment, and the amount of money that we spend or we have spent to control the zebra mussel is astronomical. So why do some species have such a negative impact and others don't? And is there a way that we can study things like the Didymo to give us an idea how we can combat the idea of an invasive species in general? So you said it was a stalked diatom. Are there stalked diatoms that don't show this kind of invasive or expansive nuisance behavior? Is there a way that we can compare those to get an idea why this is a nuisance? Is there a way that we can use what we learned there to say, well, we can make general conclusions about what creates an invasive species or a nuisance species that we can actually apply to other things, like how do we combat zebra mussels? Although the zebra mussel is sort of an interesting case in that I think the impact of zebra mussels is starting to drop off as they've been in that environment for a couple of decades. I mean, when I was in Georgian Bay in the 80s, I don't think anybody even heard of the zebra mussels. And when I came back up here around 2000, when I first met my wife and she was doing field work, the environment that she was seeing there in 2001 was so drastically different than what she'd seen in 1994. It was pretty amazing. So, how do we expand from studying this one species to bigger pictures of invasive species in general?
Well, you raise a lot of really good questions, and this is why invasive species ecology is its own discipline, and there's books being written about it, and there's debates being conducted. And well, first of all, you did, when you mentioned Drosophila and how it's actually a really good model organism when we're comparing, doing genomics and looking at understanding why certain species have certain characteristics. Well, Didymo does have related stalked diatoms that, interestingly enough, some have been found to bloom in their own native habitat very, very infrequently, though. So I think that would be a really good study, is to select a related stalked diatom and compare its genome to Didymo and to see what the differences are, and if you can target those genes that maybe are allowing for Didymo to be more aggressive in its behavior of taking over its habitat. But with respect to...
Hang on, before you leave that, I think that would be awesome, and I'll bet you a cup of coffee it's not the presence or absence of genes, it's the regulation of genes. And
right,
it's something
absolutely.
about the way that those genes are regulated that make Didymo nasty and the other one's not nasty.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
That's something...
Yeah,
okay,
no, I totally agree, because I'm not a geneticist, but from what I do understand now, because I am dabbling in genomics, is that, the genes are probably identical, but it is the regulation of those genes that really changes the behavior. It could be such a small change or difference that can result in a huge, difference in behavior, or at least growth behavior. So, but your other part of your question, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Unfortunately, there's a lot of... when we look at invasive species, we can kind of lump them and say here are the generalities, but it seems that each invasive species has some of its own unique characteristics. What's interesting about invasive species is that the ones that become invasive are really only a small fraction of the numbers of species that we transport around the world, many times over. And so Drosophila and dandelions and many of naturalized species have really come, and they've really kind of naturalized, adapted to living here and not causing too much concern, maybe a little bit of a nuisance as weedy species or nuisance species, but otherwise not nearly as problematic. So it does get quite complicated.
But I think some of that is what we define as nuisance. And I was having a really interesting conversation with a Ministry of Natural Resources biologist, I think this past fall, about invasive species. And there are a number of species that the MNR is really concerned about, right? Well, if you think of an invasive species as something that we've introduced that has then taken to that environment, is now breeding in that environment, there are all sorts of invasive trout species in Ontario and salmon species. And those aren't nuisance because the fishermen like to catch those.
Absolutely.
But one way or the other, that's a freaking Pacific salmon. It's not supposed to be in Ontario.
Oh, absolutely.
And so,
it's all semantics.
And when I sort of tried to bring it up with this guy, that was the end of that conversation. He didn't want to talk about invasive pink salmon because they like to fish for pink salmon. And actually, it wasn't the pinks; it was something else he was talking about. And I said, wait a minute, that's not a native species. And no, this is an incredibly valuable resource that the MNR will be managing. It's like, but it's an introduced species. So, as you say, the semantics between introduced and invasive.
That's the escape species. That's the escaped salmon that came off the salmon farms. They've walked from stream to stream.
No, the rainbows that are released from the accidentally released from the farms. I've fished for those too, but that's a different story. When I collect Drosophila melanogaster in the composter in my backyard, and I do this as part of my research on a fairly regular basis, when I started doing that when I was a postdoc down in New York, somewhere between half and maybe 3/4 of the flies that I would collect were introduced species. And it was really interesting to me as a geneticist, but as somebody with an interest in natural history, that there were so few or such a low percentage of natural species that I was actually collecting, that most of the species that we were collecting were actually introduced. But we don't think of them as invasive species, but they're obviously displacing, or I think they're apparently displacing the natural fly species that are there. But because they're not causing a great economic impact, they're not making it onto our radar of concerns. They're not a didymo, they're not a zebra mussel. But the impact that we as a species have had on the complexity of the environment around us is pretty impressive. And this was just at the level of fruit flies in my composter, let alone microbes and anything else.
Well, it's interesting because what we would refer to as introduced species, such as the Norway rat and Drosophila, they haven't really had much of an impact on native ecosystems in North America because they do so well in urban environments. So they're really not interacting very much with natural ecosystems in North America, but they just really have adapted very well to living with humans and living in the types of environments we create. So that's probably why they got kind of under the radar as invasive species, but they're certainly introduced species.
We had the pleasure today of talking with Dr. Andrea Kirkwood from the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Dr. Kirkwood, Andrea, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We really appreciate your time. We have to cut the show a little bit short today. We've got some other commitments. But, Colin, do you want a chance for one last question that Dr. Kirkwood before we sign off?
Sure, that'd be great. I mean, one of the things that I always talk about being a K-12 educator and science educator and high school science teacher is there what would you talk about with either science teachers or students in terms of understanding and, more importantly, getting involved to really understand sort of just the concept of invasive species, maybe Rock Snot in particular, but what do you sort of say when you talk to kids?
Well, when I talk to kids, it's really the best thing is if they can come out and do any sort of field trips or going to their local conservation authority. Many of those, even the MNR has lots of literature and fact sheets on invasive species in their area. And really, it doesn't take much. You can even just go to a meadow. You can see purple loosestrife, which is a well-known invasive species. And there's a number of invasive species, whether it be plants or animals, that they can probably see firsthand. Even starlings are introduced, although naturalized now, but they can be considered an invasive species as well. So really, it's connecting with their local conservation authorities and other groups that are really interested in protecting local ecosystems.
Perfect.
If you have any information on that you'd like to share, forward it over to us, Andrea. We'll put it in the show notes.
Sure.
Those show notes can be found at twise.vrod.ca. And on behalf of Colin Jagoe from the Kawartha Pioneers District School Board and Dr. Thomas Merritt at Laurentian University, thank you very much for being on the show today. We really appreciate your time. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think for the most part we stayed on topic. We were off for a little bit, but nevertheless, I think it was a lot of fun, and we do appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to This Week in Science and Education. We'll see you all again next week.